The moon was a thin silver sliver hanging over the great mosswoods, but its light did not reach the forest floor. Usually, this hour was the most magical for Leo the fox. The woods were typically a tapestry of blinking emeralds and drifting gold as thousands of fireflies performed their nightly dance. Their light would illuminate the mossy trails, turning the gnarled roots of the ancient oaks into glowing pathways. But tonight, the darkness was absolute. It was a thick, velvety void that seemed to swallow even the keenest of eyes. Leo stood at the mouth of his den, his ears swiveling to catch the sounds of the night. He heard the nervous rustle of the field mice and the confused fluttering of the owls, who found themselves unable to hunt in a world without a single spark of light. The fireflies were still there. Leo could feel the faint brush of their wings against his whiskers, but they were cold. Their lanterns had gone out, leaving them as nothing more than tiny, frightened shadows drifting in the gloom. The fox looked down at his own tail. The very tip was a shock of pure, snowy white. In the pitch blackness, it was the only thing that held a ghost of a shimmer, catching what little starlight filtered through the canopy. He knew what had happened. The ancient tales told of the mother flame, a primordial spark deep within the earth caves that gave the fireflies their heat and light. If the flame flickered, the forest dimmed. If it died, the night would remain forever cold. With a soft huff of determination, Leo began his descent. He moved away from the familiar sense of his territory, heading toward the iron crags where the earth split open into deep, winding tunnels. The journey was treacherous. Without the fireflies to guide the way, Leo had to rely on his pores, feeling for the shift from soft soil to hard, jagged stone. He bumped against the rough bark of trees and waded through thickets of thorn, his white tail tip bobbing like a small, lonely buoy in a dark sea. As he reached the entrance of the earth caves, he felt a swarm of fireflies follow him. They clung to his fur, desperate for the warmth of his body and the faint beacon of his white tail. He was their only hope. He stepped into the cave, the air turning cool and smelling of damp minerals and old time. The tunnel sloped sharply downward. Leo moved with a predator's grace, his claws clicking against the limestone. He could feel the tiny weight of the insects on his back, hundreds of them, shivering in the dark. The further he went, the more the silence pressed in. The caves were a labyrinth of narrow passages and vast, echoing chambers. In some places, water dripped from the ceiling with a rhythmic thrum that sounded like a slow, stone heart. Leo used his tail to sweep the ground ahead of him, the white fur reflecting the absolute minimum of light needed to avoid the deep crevices that pockmarked the cave floor. He was a creature of the surface, of wind and grass. Yet here he was, burrowing deep into the belly of the world. After hours of navigating the gloom, Leo smelled something different. It wasn't the dampness of the cave, but a sharp, dry scent like sun-baked stones or the air before a lightning strike. He rounded a sharp corner and entered a chamber so large he could not see the ceiling. In the centre sat a pedestal of black obsidian, and upon it rested the mother flame. It was not a roaring fire, but a single, pulsing coal that glowed with a faint, dying violet hue. It was gasping for air, fading into grey ash. The fireflies on Leo's back began to buzz in a low, warning hum. It flew toward the pedestal, but could not find the strength to glow. Leo approached the flame. He saw that a heavy, damp moss had grown over the air vents in the cave floor, choking the heat and starving the spark. Without a word, Leo began to work. He used his paws to tear away the thick, wet carpet of moss, his claws pulling at the stubborn roots. He cleared the vents, allowing the deep warmth of the earth's core to rise once more. He then turned to the mother flame. It needed a catalyst, a spark of life to return it to its golden glory. Leo knelt by the obsidian pedestal. He didn't have flint or steel, but he had the warmth of his own spirit. He began to wag his tail, faster and faster. The white tip brushed against the dying coal. The friction, the heat of his blood, and the purity of his intent acted like a bellows. A single orange spark jumped from his fur to the coal. The chamber erupted. The mother flame roared back to life, transforming from a dying violet spark into a towering pillar of brilliant, golden fire. The warmth washed over Leo like a summer afternoon. One by one, the fireflies began to catch the light. Their abdomens pulsed, turning from dull grey to vibrant, electric green and warm amber. The chamber was suddenly filled with thousands of tiny stars, all swirling in a celebratory dance around the fox and the flame. But the work was only half done. The fireflies were disoriented by the depth of the cave. Leo turned toward the tunnel entrance. He raised his tail high, the white tip now glowing with a borrowed radiance from the mother flame. He began the long climb back to the surface. He was no longer a lone fox in the dark. He was the leader of a luminous parade. A river of gold followed him through the limestone corridors, illuminating every crack and every drop of water until the cave looked like it was made of diamonds. When Leo finally emerged from the iron cracks, the forest was waiting. He stood on a high ledge, and with a final flick of his tail, he signaled the fireflies to disperse. They flooded out of the cave like a sparkling tide, washing over the great moss woods. The owls let out a chorus of hoots as their hunting grounds were restored. The mice scurried back into the shadows, and the deer lifted their heads to watch the return of the light. Leo trotted back to his den, his white tail tip still shimmering slightly in the dark. He had walked into the deep earth to find fire, and in doing so, he had brought the stars back down to the trees. He curled up in his bed of leaves, watching the fireflies dance outside his door, the rhythmic blinking a silent thank you to the fox who led them home. As Leo descended deeper into the gullet of the earth caves, the path forward became a trial of instinct over sight. The walls of the primary tunnel began to narrow, pressing in on his ribs until he had to exhale just to squeeze through the tightest gaps of jagged cords. The fireflies, sensing the restriction, clung tighter to his fur, their tiny legs tickling his skin as they sought refuge from the crushing weight of the stone. The first true obstacle appeared as a wide, bottomless chasm that cut through the centre of a cathedral-sized cavern. Usually, the bridge across this gap was a natural limestone arch, but the dampness of the cave and the lack of warmth from the dying mother flame had caused a slick, black algae to coat the surface. To a fox, balance was second nature, but the darkness made the distance impossible to judge. Leo paused at the edge of the abyss. He lowered his head, sweeping his white-tipped tail forward. He watched the way the pale fur caught the dimmest reflections of the cavern walls, using the movement to map the void. He began to cross, his claws unsheathed to find purchase in the slime. Halfway across, a sudden gust of cold air surged from the depths of the earth, threatening to blow the light-deprived fireflies from his back like autumn leaves. Leo crouched low, digging his claws into the stone and shielding the insects with his body until the wind subsided. Beyond the chasm lay the Whispering Gallery, a section of the cave where the stalactites hung so low they formed a dense forest of stone needles. Here, the silence was replaced by a confusing trick of acoustics. Every click of Leo's claws was echoed and amplified, bouncing off the walls until it sounded like 100 predators were closing in from every direction. The fireflies grew restless, the wings buzzing in a frantic, dissonant hum that clouded Leo's hearing. He had to stop, closing his eyes to shut out the phantom movements of the shadows. He focused entirely on the scent of the dry, ionized air he had detected earlier. He moved not by the map of the echoes, but by the pull of the heat at the back of his throat. He navigated the stone needles with a rhythmic swing of his body, his white tail acting as a pendulum that kept his orientation true when the world felt like it was spinning. The final barrier before the mother flame was the Chamber of Mists. Here, a subterranean hot spring had collided with the cooling air of the dying cave, creating a fog so thick it felt like wet wool. The mist was heavy with the scent of sulphur, and it threatened to douse the spirit of the fireflies entirely. Leo's white tail tip was nearly invisible in the haze. He didn't panic. He began to huff, a rhythmic barking breath that cleared small pockets of air in front of his nose. He used his tail not just as a beacon, but as a fan, whipping the air into a small vortex that drew the fireflies into a tight, protective spiral. He pushed through the heaviness, his muscles burning from the climb, until the grey fog began to glow with that sickly, fading violet light of the failing heart of the earth. Each obstacle had stripped away a layer of the fox's caution, leaving only the raw necessity of the mission. By the time he reached the obsidian pedestal, Leo was covered in the dust of the deep earth, his russet fur greyed by stone powder, but his white tail remained a pure, defiant signal against the gloom. As the fireflies spilled out from the iron crags, the great moss woods underwent a transformation that felt like a long-awaited exhale. The absolute, suffocating blackness shattered into 10,000 shards of dancing light. From the high ridges to the dampest hollows, the forest was reborn in a pulse of emerald, gold, and soft violet. High above in the canopy of the silver oaks, the great horned owls were the first to react. For hours, they had sat paralysed on their branches, their sensitive eyes pained by the lack of even a single moonbeam to define the edges of the world. Now, as a swarm of amber fireflies ascended into the leaves, the owls stretched their wings with a magnificent, soft rustle. They didn't hunt immediately. Instead, they let out a series of resonant, booming hoots that rolled through the valley like thunder. It was a signal of relief, a proclamation that the blind night had ended. In the low thickets, the nocturnal mammals emerged from their burrows, a family of badgers who had been huddled in a defensive ball near the riverbank, unfurled themselves. They watched with curious grunts as the fireflies settled on the nearby ferns, turning the green fronds into glowing lanterns. The badger cubs began to pounce at the drifting lights, their clumsy movements a sign that the tension of the dark had broken. Even the florist seemed to celebrate. The night-blooming jasmine, which had kept its petals tightly furled in the cold absence of the fireflies' warmth, began to open. The scent of the flowers, heavy and sweet, drifted on the wind, guided by the heat of the fireflies' glow. The forest was no longer a place of hidden dangers, but a ballroom of light and shadow. Leo the fox watched this from the ledge of the crags for a moment longer than necessary. He saw the way the light moved, how it flowed like water through the ravines and pooled in the clearings. He felt a deep, weary satisfaction in his bones. The journey back to his den was far easier than the journey away. The trail was now a highway of gold. As he trotted through the undergrowth, the fireflies parted before him like a royal guard, then closed in behind him, illuminating his path. He passed the stream where the water reflected the glowing swarm above, making it look as though the river itself were filled with fallen stars. As the first hint of dawn began to bleach the eastern sky, turning the deep indigo to a pale, milky blue. Leo reached the familiar roots of his oak tree. The fireflies began to dim their lanterns, tucking themselves under leaves and into the deep moss to rest for the coming day. The natural light of the sun was taking over, but the magic of the night remained etched in the damp earth. Leo stepped into his den, his paws heavy with the dust of the earth caves. He spent a long time grooming his fur, meticulously cleaning the stone powder from his russet coat until he reached the tip of his tail. He licked the white fur clean, noting how it still seemed to hold a faint, silvery luster even in the growing daylight. He curled into a tight circle, his chin resting on his flank. Outside, the morning birds began their dawn chorus, a different kind of music from the rhythmic buzzing of the fireflies, but just as welcome. Leo closed his eyes, his breathing slowing as he drifted into a deep, well-earned sleep. The mother flame was burning bright, the fireflies were home, and the fox who had led them back was finally at rest.